Before we begin our next panel, we're going to take a moment to pay tribute to the memory of Stephen Sotloff, an insightful and brave journalist who was murdered last September by terrorists affiliated with the Islamic State. Now, some of us at FDD had the privilege of knowing Steve personally when he was a visiting fellow at FDD back in 2011. He didn't write for FDD in Washington. He felt compelled to travel to places like Libya and Yemen and Egypt. He believed in the importance of getting the stories of people on the ground in war-torn countries because he wanted to give voice to the victims of these terrible conflicts. Ultimately, Stephen traveled to Syria. He went there to examine what was happening to people living under Bashar Assad's rule. 2 years after the first protests erupted, those were peaceful protests when they began, but 2 years later, only 60,000 people were dead. There were nearly 3 million refugees. More recent tallies, of course, have well over 200,000 dead and nearly 10 million refugees are displaced. Stephen traveled to the Atma refugee camp to talk to people who had little food, barely enough water, a few blankets in the middle of winter. He went back to Syria in August 2013 to continue this work. During the year in which Stephen was kidnapped and held against his will, a few people at FDD were honored to have been taken into the Sotloff family's confidence. For a year, they worked with Stephen's parents, Shirley and Arthur, to do what could be done in an effort to secure Stephen's freedom. Despite such efforts, after 13 months, terrorists of the Islamic State murdered Stephen in cold blood. His death was a tragedy for the family, but it was also an atrocity. Millions of people around the world have come to know Stephen since then, however, to respect his work and to be inspired by his bravery. So today we honor the values and journalistic ethics that imbued Stephen's work and his life. We'll be talking in a few minutes with a panel whom I'll introduce to you about doing journalism in the age of holy terror. First, I'd like to acknowledge Shirley and Arthur Sotloff. We are fortunate to have them with us here today. The Sotloff family established the Two Lives Foundation to continue Stephen's legacy by supporting journalists and their families affected by the realities of reporting from conflict-torn or disaster settings, and by bringing the stories of people who are suffering to people who can make a difference. We at FDD were honored to have known and worked with Stephen for a while. Two Lives is a fitting tribute to his work. Shirley and Arthur, please join me on the stage to share a few words with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cliff, for your moving comments about Stephen and for all the support FDD provided during Stephen's time in captivity. Everyone has two lives. The second one begins when you realize you only have one. These are the words our late son, Stephen Joel Sotloff, wrote during his 13 months of captivity. Stephen began to accept that he would not return home, that his first life he had relished and lived to the fullest was coming to an end. His second life began. He urged his family not to grieve for him, but instead to honor him by cherishing the freedoms we have. The past few months have been difficult for our family as we grapple with the reality that Stephen's jovial attitude and scholarly wisdom are no longer with us. We will forever miss his warm heart, inclusive spirit, and unbounded generosity. He was big-hearted and open-handed. His curiosity and love for people had no bounds. Today, Arthur and I are here for Stephen. We want to keep his memory and his legacy alive, and so we have created the Two Lives Foundation. Through this organization, we will be able to support aspiring young journalists to communicate the common struggles of hope that people everywhere share. The United Nations declares freedom of speech as a global human right, but as we know, not everyone in the world has the privilege of this right. This is a primary reason why journalists from the free world bravely work to tell the stories of those who cannot tell their own. As you know, Stephen was committed to telling the stories of those who are denied freedom of speech. He was dedicated to working in those areas of the world where free speech was limited or even harshly prevented. He was passionate about telling the story of the unimaginable loss of life and atrocities of the Syrian civil war, even before the current uprising. A major factor that fueled the beginning of that conflict was the defense of speech, of freedom of speech. As those individuals continue to fight for free speech, it is crucial that all of us continue the quest to tell their stories. Stephen chose his life's work because of his passion for telling the stories of those oppressed. He believed in democracy and the ideals and freedoms it afforded persecuted people. He knew all too well that many in the Middle East did not enjoy these same liberties. Stephen made it his mission to expose their plight, hoping that his reporting would spur others to use their power to bring them those same freedoms. Our family is touched by FDD's honor of Stephen's work and his life, and thank FDD and this distinguished audience here today for the special tribute. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How are you? My wife has touched upon most of the themes that we wanted to stress, but I want to make a few brief comments. Since the day Stephen was kidnapped, no one helped us much as the FDD team. We were put in touch with Jonathan Schanzer from the first days of Stephen's incarceration. Working with people like John Hanna, FDD was able to reach the White House, ambassadors, and other government officials to make sure that Stephen was not forgotten. When we first came to Washington in December 2013, it was FDD which arranged all our meetings with Congress. We could have never have opened the doors FDD did. Toby Dershowitz took us everywhere and sacrificed countless hours for our cause. We are lucky to call Toby a friend. Her presence helped to ease the pain we silently bore as we labored under the media blackout. She often called us, sometimes several times a week, giving us updates, running ideas past us, and just being a friend. We would like to thank everybody at FDD and for the help they provided us. Stephen never knew what you did, but we do, and we are very grateful for that. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to make very brief introductions of our panelists. Then I'm going to ask just a few questions. So you should be thinking about your questions because I want you to be involved in this conversation as quickly as we can. Let me start with Nazila Fathi. She's a former Iran correspondent for the New York Times. During the height of the Green Revolution in 2009, she was forced to flee the country. We'll want to find out the details of that shortly. Jamie Detmer is a journalist and broadcaster for the Daily Beast and Voice of America. He's a reporter from inside Syria, from Libya, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, and Turkey. And Dexter Filkins is a staff writer for The New Yorker, and a Pulitzer Prize winner and recipient of 2 George Polk Awards. You're probably familiar with all their works. I hope so. Let me start with, set it at the table this way. Many years ago, late 70s, the early 1980s, I was a foreign correspondent in places like Iran during the 1979 revolution, Ireland during the Troubles. I covered some small African wars. I was in Pakistan in the early 80s. Bad things could happen. You could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Never did I think anybody that I wanted to interview wanted to kill me. It never occurred to me I could sit down with very hard men, as they call them in Ireland, and they'd want to tell me their stories, so I'd fill my notebook, and I'd take my notebook, and I would tell their stories and help them make their arguments to the public. And that was the convention of journalism back then. And I think it changed, not overnight, but we understood it changed overnight, when a journalist for the Wall Street Journal by the name of Daniel Pearl went for an interview, thinking he was going to fill a notebook, and instead they considered, we don't need you to tell our story, we'll tell our story, we'll tell our story by cutting off your head on videotape and posting it on the internet. That's how we'll tell our story. That's quite a change, isn't it? And let me start with you, Jamie, because you've been in the parts of Syria where James Foley was, where Stephen Sotloff was. Talk a little bit about this, the current reality that a journalist faces if you want to be on the ground filling notebooks in these places.
Well, first of all, I think that the change, in some senses, occurred before that and before it involved the Western press, because for a long time in Mexico and Colombia, journalists have been targeted and have been killed, and it didn't get much reporting. The numbers are kind of large, and that goes back a considerable length of time before all the troubles in the Middle East. But it is certainly in the Middle East, and I also cover Ukraine. In Ukraine as well, we have become the targets. We have become the bullseye, and the impact is tremendous. We've just heard, movingly from the Sotloff families, the killings, the murders of James Foley and Steve Sotloff has had an incredible impact on our coverage since then. One, there's a personal impact on us. Many of us knew either James or Steve or both of them. And so there's a feeling of outrage and anger and sadness that affects us, I think, and maybe we're less detached in some ways than we were before. There's a second impact, of course, in that since then, many major media organizations do not want us inside Syria. I've not been back inside Syria since James and Steve were murdered this summer, partly because my employers at the Beast and the VOA are very uncomfortable about me going in. And even if I come up with plans for going in, they're vetoing them. And I'm not the only one who's having this. I mean, a lot of other media organizations don't want their people inside. And I must say, the various plans that I've come up with for going in and to get back to Aleppo haven't even convinced me. In order to reduce as much as I can the risk. You have the risk anyway, of course, if you're covering war or being in the line of fire or being caught in crossfire or being hit by a barrel bomb or being hit by an airstrike. But now we have to deal with the Islamic State and we have to deal with Jabhat al-Nusra. And the point that I must stress there is that Jabhat al-Nusra has also been changing and transforming in the last few months and are becoming far more vicious and violent in the areas that they're governing, for example, in Idlib. So if you're trying to get into Aleppo or in parts of northern Syria, you've somehow got to get around Jabhat al-Nusra, who I've tried to negotiate with for safe passage, which has been refused, and the Islamic State on the other side. The other problem that we're having in terms of the reality on the ground is we can't trust anyone. We know that a lot of these recent kidnappings, fixers or drivers or others were involved in those kidnappings. We're pinpointing the people who were kidnapped. So the effect of this is that there's less what I would call ground truth. We're not covering Syria in the way that we did before the summer, where there were a lot of journalists around, covering a lot of stories, getting that 10% of ground truth, which is absolutely essential, getting the nuances. So it has had a chilling effect. And I think it's emboldened other groups to be far more seeing us as targets and of use in propaganda terms if they kidnap us or kill us. We only had last week Ned Parker from the Reuters agency in Baghdad having to leave Iraq because he's been threatened by senior Shia militiamen who actually extended that threat to all Western journalists working in Iraq. So it has had a chilling impact, a chilling effect, and we've seen a sea change.
Dexter, I'm going to you next. If you do get into some of these places, they do decide to give you safe passage and let you in. It's probably not in most cases because they have a strong commitment to freedom of the press and the people's right to know. It's because they want to utilize you to tell stories that they want to tell. And again, if they can do that better by cutting your throat, they will. But if they can utilize you, they will. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that's it. I think they don't need us the way they used to. So they can write their own stories and put it up on the web, or they can do their own videos and put them up. And so We're not essential to them. I mean, and I just want to say, I mean, just how it's changed over the course of my career. I was in Pakistan when Danny was kidnapped, and I remember the stories coming over the wires, and people were gossiping about it. And I honestly, I was so incredulous that something like that could happen. I'd spent a lot of time in Pakistan, and it's a crazy place, but nothing like that had ever happened. And I didn't really sink in at first. And you could go anywhere in those days, anywhere, and without fear. In fact, being an American was like, it was like wearing armor, you know. And like the worst thing that was going to happen to you was you'd be arrested. Like I got arrested by the Taliban when they were governing Kabul in 2000, and you know, they slapped me around a little bit and held me for a couple of days, but they weren't going to do anything to me. I mean, you could see they were afraid. They were like, what do we do with this guy? You know, because the 101st Airborne, you know, could come down and get him. And that just, I got arrested in Pakistan. I drove into the tribal areas in Pakistan in 2002. You know, that place, if you went in there now, I'd last about 20 minutes, you know. And I went in there, I drove around. I can't remember what crazy thing I was trying to find out at the time, but I got arrested. The police officer, the Pakistani guy, was kind of angry at me, and I had to spend the night like in his office, and he sent me home the next day. Everything changed in Iraq. I worked for the New York Times then. We went into Iraq, we rented a house in a neighborhood, and we just set up like we would anywhere else. I mean, there wasn't any electricity or anything, so it was difficult, but it wasn't dangerous. But by the time a year later, 2 years later, protecting ourselves was the largest single expense that we had. We had 75 armed guards around this little house in the neighborhood. We had 75 armed guards.
75.
We had belt-fed machine guns on the roof. We had searchlights, blast walls, hand grenades. I mean, we had everything. It was insane. And I think when I used to go in, when any correspondent would go in for the New York Times, they tried to take care of the people who were going in, and so they would take out a life insurance policy for the people who were inside. And so usually the Times had 6 or 7 people in Baghdad at any given time. They were paying $15,000 a month life insurance for each person who was in. So I mean, it was insane. I mean, it was just off the charts. And I just remember, how it changed. You know, we could go anywhere in Iraq in the early days of the war. You could go to a Sunni village in the middle of what's now controlled by ISIS, and it's the same guys. You know, go anywhere you wanted. But that just started to change. They started to come after us, and I remember we reached the conclusion pretty quickly that we were targets too. That they see an American. The first thing they think really is not, I think I want to kill this guy. I honestly think that your greatest danger by far is being kidnapped, because if they see a Westerner, you are first and foremost a pile of money, and somebody's going to pay to get you out, and they don't care who. And so, you know, in Baghdad, I don't want to go on forever, but in Baghdad, I think in 2006, I remember an American official told me that 40 or 50 people a day on average were being kidnapped in Baghdad, and it was just a complete state of nature. And what typically happened was you would be kidnapped by a criminal gang, and then they would sell you to one of the crazy groups, like Al-Qaeda, that really wanted you, that wanted to make a video. And there was actually a place, there was a neighborhood that was out of the control of the Americans. There was an old racetrack there, and the kidnappers used to have auctions there for the people that they had kidnapped. And that's what we were dealing with then. It was just insane. And it's changed so much over just the course of my career. That's only 15 years that I first went to Pakistan. And my colleague, who I think is here, Jeff Goldberg, for The Atlantic, wrote a very nice piece recently about all this. I mean, Jeff and I ran into each other in Afghanistan in 1998. You know, the Taliban were ruling Afghanistan. We went anywhere we wanted. That world is long gone.
You know, and there's one point I just want to stress here is that back in the day, say when I was a foreign correspondent, if I was working for, say, the New York Times in Africa, There were loads of freelancers, loads of stringers. Okay, I had a better expense account than they did. But other than that, it was the same. But if you're a freelancer or a stringer, you don't have 75 guards. You can't afford that. You don't have a big life insurance policy. You can't afford that. You're in there, on a wing and a prayer, essentially, hoping that your fixer is an honest one. And I want to get back to the issue of fixers in a minute. I'm going to hold on to that thought. And I want to go to Nazila, and I want you to comment on anything you heard, or just tell us the story of what happened to you in Iran most recently, where, by the way, and I don't want to leave this out, and I'm going to come back to it, I hope everybody knows this, there's a Washington Post correspondent, Jason Razian, who has been in prison since July while we're going on with these negotiations. What is his crime? As far as we can tell, absolutely nothing. We don't know of anything he's done wrong. In fact, from my reading, he bent over backwards to be positive about this regime and about life in Iran. Nonetheless, he's in prison all this time without a lawyer, without charges filed, without it being a point in the negotiations. I think that's sort of outrageous. Of course, there are other Americans being held hostage there. But by the way, and I'm going to come back to this too, this is also a way to encourage les autres. In other words, to show other journalists that we can take you too if you displease us at any time here in Iran. So let me ask you to.
Well, Cliff, I'm so glad that you raised Jason's case because, as you said, he was the kind of reporter that you never expected him to get into trouble. He was extremely cautious. He never wrote anything critical of the regime. So I'm still wondering why he landed in prison. I was in Tehran during, I would say, the better days. In 2009, when I left the country, things were starting to get really ugly. I had been based in Tehran for the New York Times since the mid-1990s. I never got work permits until 1999. For 4 or 5 years, I had to work secretly, or I would get work permits that allowed me to work legally only for a couple of weeks. So for a long time, I was not able to file stories under my name. I contributed to stories that other people like Dexter wasn't covering Iran then, but so many other people who were outside the country. And this was an advantage because this didn't even exist in the 80s when Khomeini was alive. And just to rewind the tape, go back to what you mentioned, even Khomeini realized that he could get by without giving interviews to foreign correspondents. He discovered cassette tapes, and he realized that he could reach Iranian people inside the country through those tapes that he was smuggling inside the country. He didn't need reporters anymore, so he stopped giving interviews. So after his death, things became easier. People like me were allowed to be in touch with foreign correspondents. I was the fixer first before I became a reporter. It was tough. I was being summoned all the time. I was being intimidated. But still, nobody put me in jail. Nobody accused me of any serious charges. And in '99, when conditions got better, I was given permission to work legally as a New York Times correspondent. And everybody remembers what happened in 2009. There were huge outpourings, demonstrations against the regime. People believed that the elections were rigged. And then reporters were targeted again. People who were inside the country on visa, they were quickly sort of expelled. The government refused to extend their visas. And in the end, there were just a couple of us dual nationals who they couldn't kick out of the country, but they sent us letters and requested that we don't cover what was happening on the streets, which was almost impossible because for me, they were the biggest events of the country, since the revolution. I was too young to remember what had happened in '79. And everybody was saying that this was even bigger because the population was twice larger. And every day at 3 o'clock, I would watch people on my street just around 3 o'clock marching toward the main street to protest. So it was impossible not to cover. There was an energy in the air that drew you. And of course, there was violence. People were getting shot. People were getting killed. I went out despite the ban. I was getting threats from some people I knew who were being sympathetic, from people from the intelligence ministry. until one day I noticed there was a big team out of my house. I mean, it was shocking, 16 men in 4 cars, 2 motorcycles. They started chasing me when I left the house. I just made a round around the block and came back home. I never left my house until 3 nights later when I left the country. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left the country. I heard that an arrest warrant was issued for me a day after I had left the country. But even at that time, even when I knew that I could get arrested, I never knew what was happening to other colleagues who had been arrested. I mean, Mazia Bahari was picked up just a few days before I left the country. He was tortured, he was beaten up. Eventually he was released. It took about 3 months, but it looks like the pattern is getting worse and worse. I mean, everybody knew after 3 months they had to either charge him with something or let him go. Now Jason has been arrested for over 7 months. He's been held without any charges against him. Nobody knows where he is and what's going to happen to him. So I mean, the situation is just getting worse. The patterns are different in different countries, but then we lose sight of what these kinds of treatments, the brutality, does to the stories that are getting out of the country.
Let me ask this question. I know I can see you chomping at the bit, but I'll let you say what you want. But I'm going to throw another question at the same time, and it's a hard question, but it's a question that I'm sure you've all asked yourselves and are asking yourselves. So I'd like you to answer it or begin to. For this audience, is given what we know now about the changed realities in places like eastern Syria, western Iraq, is it really worth it? Is it worth risking your life for the kind of story you can get? Which is not the kind of story you could get once upon a time. Yes, you can get a story on the people who are living there. But if I go and say to you, you know what, Jason, I want you to go into Syria, and I want you to find out what kind of relations the Al-Nusra Front has with the Islamic State and also with the more moderate groups. Can you find that out for me? I'm going to tell you, my guess is you can't.
I think each journalist has to answer that question for themselves.
Well, answer for yourself.
For myself, I went back. I'd been a war correspondent, foreign correspondent, different parts of the world during my career. I had stopped doing wars for many years. I went back 3 years ago, partly because a very good friend of mine was killed in Syria, Marie Colvin. And it was a driver for me to go back to cover because I found that she was an inspiring, generous, warm, and incredible human being. And I felt there should be journalists doing what she had been doing. I take inspiration from James and Steve, and it's what will drive me to continue for as long as this rather elderly body continues to be able to go around the Middle East. But you know, the question you ask is about a particular story. We are all responsible, as our employers are, to try to reduce the risk as much as we can. So if you're going to go and do a story or go into an area, you have to be satisfied, and you have to satisfy your editors, that you really have reduced the risk, and you think that you can get in and get out. If you can't get out and you can't file, you've actually failed in your mission. Your purpose is to file a story. My father was a journalist, and actually he gave me about 2 pieces of advice in my life. One was to duck when I went to my first war, to remember to duck, and the second was always file. Make sure you file. So that's an essential point. I want to take up something else you raised, though, about the Washington Post journalist Jason, and the fact that this hasn't become an issue for the administration. I think a lot of us were extremely surprised and disappointed in the wake of the kidnapping of Steve Sotloff and James Foley at the lack of reaction from the administration and from some people on Capitol Hill. I know from personal conversations I've had with administration officials and with Capitol Hill staffers that they almost consider us an irritant. I don't think covering wars or being a foreign correspondent or trying to provide information to the American public should be considered an irritant. I think we do an essential job, and I take great offense at those remarks. I take great offense that we didn't have FBI agents, for example, quickly into South Syria after Steve and James went missing to try to find out what happened to them. You know, we know that people who were involved with them, fixers, were never interviewed by the FBI or were very belatedly interviewed by the FBI. And I think this goes into another issue, that maybe they find us an irritant because they don't like our coverage, but we are enmeshed in a very important liberal value. And this is a fight about ideology in many ways and about liberal values, and I think the administration and Capitol Hill should be far more outspoken about the importance of press freedom and far more outspoken when American or Western journalists go missing or are killed.
You want another? Can I give you another question, or you want to add on to this? Which
Talking to me?
Yeah, I'll give you another question, then you can add on anything else. Okay. So there's another portion of this. There's a very fine journalist, I think, by the name of Mate Friedman, and after the Gaza war last summer, he wrote a series of pieces in the Atlantic and Tablet about how journalists in Gaza were being intimidated and directed to produce certain kinds of stories and to avoid certain kinds of stories and certain pictures while in Gaza. And there were also, and this is another part of it, those agenda-driven journalists who said very clearly, I'm here in Gaza to cover the Palestinian side of the story, and NBC journalist said that. One side of the story, that's what I'm here to cover. So I'll talk a little bit about the tendency to intimidate journalists, to tell the story. And of course, in Gaza, we have had journalists kidnapped, two from Fox, Steve Santani and Olaf Wig, and they were held and they were converted at knife point, and their names were changed. Again, it shows others what they can expect. We've had this, was a BBC correspondent also held. Talk about the ability of some of these regimes to direct the coverage the way they want to.
Well, look, I mean, that's an old story. You know, governments, whether they're not democratic or whether they are, have been trying to intimidate, you know, reporters into various means to tell the kind of story they want. But
sometimes they succeed.
Yeah, but I think any journalist worth the name is not going to allow themselves to be intimidated like that.
You don't think it happened in Gaza? You don't think that the coverage was slanted?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say because you know, God is in the details in these things, and that's why you're there.
There were no photographs of any Hamas members in uniform or shooting rockets. Over 3,000 rockets were fired. None were shot. We had journalists who came out afterwards and said, "I saw them do that. I knew if I took a picture of that, I'd be killed. I didn't take the picture."
I mean, well, I can't speak to that, but I mean, I can tell you a story. For instance, I was in Pakistan. This is a few years ago now. It was right after Bin Laden was killed, and a journalist was killed there, Salim Shahzad. He was found floating in a canal, and he'd been beaten to death, and he died a terrible death. And it seemed pretty clear to me that the government of Pakistan had done this because Salim, who I knew actually, he'd written some stories about their complicity in possibly hiding Bin Laden, and you know, so I wanted to try to figure out what happened. And you know, the government made it really difficult for me. You know, they tapped my phone. You know, there were people following me around. You know, certain people wouldn't talk to me. It was kind of creepy. You know, Pakistan's kind of creepy at night, and it's a creepy place. It's a wonderful place. It's a beautiful place. But you know, I got the story. Now look, could somebody have come in the middle of the night and like grab me and like beat the hell out of me and like pull me away? Yeah, they could have, but they didn't. And I think most governments are not willing to cross that line. So what they do is, you know, they beat their chest and they threaten you and they bluster, but.
Or they arrest Jason Razian and hold him.
Well, but that's a government willing to cross the line. But
okay.
yeah. I think most governments aren't willing to go that far.
Right.
And so I think if you're determined to get to the truth, which that's all I wanted. If I would have found out that Salim Shahzad drowned in that canal, I would have written that story. But the government of Pakistan killed him, and they did in fact. And I think you can still do that. Look, if you're up against somebody like Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS or a regime like the Iranian regime that's going to put reporters in jail and torture them in many cases. Yeah, that's different. I mean, that's a really different thing.
I want to start taking your questions. If you show me a hand, we got one back there. We can get a microphone over there. It's coming. Then we'll come back. Yep, we'll come back. Hand back up. There you go. Yeah.
Hi, Jeff Bartos from Philadelphia. Thanks so much. By the way, Dexter, you may have indicated with all that expense why the newspapers are going out of business all over the place at 75 guards and $15,000 a month for life insurance. But I just want to pick up on what you said. I mean, you said the Iranian regime is different than the Pakistani government. But back to Cliff's question, and I don't want to get away from that, isn't Hamas and his question about the way that the coverage was in Gaza, isn't Hamas a proxy for Iran? And if so, I mean, I think it's pretty clear to a lot of people that the coverage this past summer was weighted to one side, and then the question for the panel: why are we not reading about the Washington Post reporter every day that this negotiation with the Iranian regime goes on with the nuclear deal? Why are we not reading about the way that the press is being treated by Iran? Why is this not a story? Why is the press not beating the drum on that?
Well, look, the second part of that question is pretty easy, actually. I think in a lot of these cases, the families ask that they ask news organizations not to write about it, and because there's negotiations going on, or they feel like if it's publicized, it'll more than likely lead to their being killed. That happens a lot, and the news organizations usually respect that request of the family. So I think it's slightly more complicated in the latter case. But what was your first? What was the question?
Well, on Hamas, I mean, Hamas is a proxy for Iran. So you talked about
Sort of,
the Iranian
yeah.
regime differently. How is that different than what your answer was with respect to the Gaza?
I don't know if they're different. No, look, they're not different. They're trying to intimidate people to get the story that they want. I mean, they're very similar in that respect.
Can I come in on
Please come on in there, and Kate, come up here. We'll get the next
point.
question teed up. We'll be faster that way.
It's sometimes that the families are instructed by governments not to allow any publicity. I mean, this is another issue. There's a great complexity about how news organizations and families and governments respond to kidnapped journalists. And some people will say that it's important that there's no publicity because you might disrupt a negotiation. I actually, myself, have written critically about the news blackouts, in that I believe that in the first few days or it's important that there is a silence so that we can see if there's some kind of negotiation available. But I think thereafter, this often serves the governments, because if there's silence and there's no coverage, there's no pressure on them to try to up the game, to try to have more of a sense of urgency in getting the journalists back. Also, the corporations have insurers that they're often dealing with, and the insurers are often very uncomfortable about there being coverage because the security people who they're employing are saying it's better to have no coverage. So there's a great complexity when a journalist goes missing.
What I think will be a quick follow-up question before you take the next question there. Should, in any case, ransoms be paid to get journalists back?
Well, I asked the Europeans. Right.
The Europeans say yes. Most American papers say
They
no.
don't often
Some
admit
Europeans.
it. Some
I think I would
Europeans
say
admit it.
no, because it means the
I
next
think
journalist is more
it's making the problem worse
worse.
for the
Do you
Americans.
agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm conflicted about it. I mean, if I was sitting in there, I would hope someone was going to pay a ransom for me. But intellectually, I have to say that this is just feeding more terrorism and more kidnapping.
And for some countries like Iran, it's not an issue of ransom. They want something politically in
Right.
return, whether it's
Yeah.
from rival political groups inside the country or outside governments.
Or a half dozen or so Taliban leaders for a prisoner. That we won't get into
Yeah.
that controversy now either by time, but all right. But it's a good controversy.
Thank you so much for a great panel. Mariam Memar Siddiqui from Tawana, which is an e-learning institute for Iranian civil society. Quick comment and then a question. About Jason Rezaian, actually, to Dexter Filkins, it's actually the opposite. His brother is trying very hard to get media interviews, and the Washington
Really?
Post is running an ad on almost every web page, counting the number of days that he's been in prison. So
Good for
there is
them.
a real attempt to elevate the issue, but the Obama administration has made a concerted effort to keep it out for God knows what reason. I would think that would be leverage in negotiations, but they seem to be denying themselves any kind of leverage they can have. My question is, To what extent do you believe, as professional journalists, that social media and citizen journalism has allowed individuals to tell their own story, in particularly difficult places like the worst parts of the Syrian conflict? Has that taken the place of professional reporting to any valuable extent?
I think it's an important contribution, but I don't think it undermines the importance of having professional journalism around. They're telling the story from their own viewpoint. Our job is to try to contextualize an event, an issue, and to try to tell more than one story, and maybe stories from different sides. So I think that's the danger of citizen journalism. And I think that also feeds back into why there's been this change towards professional journalists generally in the Middle East and elsewhere. Dexter raised this issue that they don't need us so much because they've got social media and they can put out their own story. And I think that's true. I think the second thing that's happened, I can remember when I first started out as a journalist covering foreign stories, I was in West Africa. And there, of course, people didn't actually read what I was writing because they couldn't get the Times of London. Now, in real time, they see what we're saying, and that actually can provoke a very immediate reaction. So I think that's a contribution to this change that's happened.
Let's take a question here. Yeah.
Dave Naftali, I'm a member of the board of FDD. Dexter, you mentioned that one of the reasons you felt was that the cavalry would come in if you were, in fact, mistreated. And I wonder if you feel that the administration's policies, stated policies that the cavalry won't come in, has had any impact on how the rise of ISIS and other organizations like that.
No, I'm sorry. I meant there was a fear of the United States back
That's
then.
what I meant.
But I don't think the cavalry was ever coming. I mean, I remember, in fact, I remember the day that I got arrested by the Taliban. This is a funny story. I got arrested by the Taliban, and they were beating my translator really badly, and they were slapping me around a little bit, but I managed to get away from them, and I ran away. And this is a year before 9/11 in Kabul. And I ran down the street, and I made it to the United Nations. And I banged on the door, and I felt, my God, I'm saved. And these guys with long beards and guns were running after me. And, the security officer came to the front door and said, "Get lost. You're just causing problems for us." And so I turned around and got arrested by these guys. So, but I don't think the cavalry was ever coming then. I think, but I mean, really,
so.
it sure as heck wasn't coming to Kabul, a year before 9/11. I mean, you were alone. But there was a fear of the United States which just does not exist anymore. I mean, and I don't think it. I don't think it exists now. But I don't. I think the Obama administration did send. I think they sent the Navy SEAL. They sent the SEALs in. They launched one operation, and it was too late. But I think these guys more or less believe in a place like Eastern Syria that they can operate with total impunity. I don't think there's any fear.
They'll give time for one more question, then I'll let you all sum up anything you want to say in answer to this question.
Thank you very much. I'm Iftikhar Hussain. I work for Voice of America, Pashto to the border regions. We broadcast to that region. Discussion cannot get more interested than this one for a journalist, particularly for me who comes from that region. I'm aware of the dangers of the militants and both the government in Pakistan in the context. Dexter, I have a question for you. How much things have changed for international media, for a reporter of New York Times or any other outlet who is working in Pakistan, in terms of reaching out to the real people and getting the actual content? And secondly, in what ways things have changed for a reporter who used to be say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, and now? Thank you.
Well, that's easy. I mean, look, in Pakistan, 15 years ago, you go anywhere you wanted, anywhere.
Right.
In fact, the colleague I mentioned, Jeff Goldberg, last name Goldberg, he spent several weeks living in the same madrasa that Osama bin Laden studied in. It was just a different universe. They just didn't. If you look like an American, they left you alone. That's just.
They like you.
Yeah, come on in. Really, it was amazing. I mean, when I went to Kabul in 2000, I met the entire Taliban leadership, and we were going to meet Mullah Omar, and then somebody tried to like put a bomb in his house, and so they canceled the interview. But it was, you know, they wanted you to be there. It's completely different now. I mean, totally different. Pakistan is a really dangerous place now. It's really scary.
Do you want to, Jimmy, and go ahead and answer that question, or give you time to sum up, because that's all we have.
Well, I hope that the violence and the brutality that is going on, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, or Iran, doesn't let us to lose sight of realities on the ground. And what is it that is helping these radical groups, such as ISIS, to draw people to themselves? I mean, a lot of people are also joining ISIS because they've been victims of violence and brutality. And the violence that we see on our screens that ISIS is committing should not push us toward embracing violence. We have to, I think, seek some kind of sustainable reform in these countries, in these regions, that will stop the flow of supporters for these radical groups.
Jamie?
We've got to continue to tell the stories. I mean, Fran Townsend made a very good point this morning about the 4 million Syrian refugees, 10 million displaced. That we're seeing cycles of future violence there. I spend a lot of time with refugees, Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and inside. I was writing about children who have been through traumatic stress syndrome. We know that they are going to be predisposed to anger and violence in the future. Not all will become suicide bombers. Not all will become militants. But if they're channeled a certain way, even a small percentage doing that, are going to be a huge problem in the future. So we're seeing these cycles. We need to be telling those stories because we need, I think the fundamental reason why a lot of people do what we do is that Christina Lamb, a friend of mine at Sunday Times, put it very well, that you're outside somewhere, you see something bad happening, you want to tell people about it because you want it to change. That's fundamentally what we're about. And so we've got to continue to tell these stories and to the best of our ability, not be silenced by the militants.
Well, I think we only scratched the surface of an important issue, but we've scratched it, I hope, interestingly. I think so. Perilous times for foreign correspondents right now, and it's not clear how this comes out. Thanks to Nazila, thanks to Jamie, thanks to Dexter. Let's give a big round of applause. Thank you.